relevant, still ricocheted inside my skull, a tiny venom-tipped dart. It permeated the air in my car, clinging despite the AC blasting, trying to banish the Texas heat from the open windows. The sun, a brutal orb above the Fort Worth skyline, did little to warm the cold spot that had settled deep in my chest. Sophia had delivered it with such casual indifference, as if discussing the weather, not dissecting my entire existence over lukewarm iced tea and a plate of barely touched deviled eggs. My fingers gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The road ahead blurred slightly. It had been a typical Sunday family luncheon, the kind where everyone gathered at Aunt Carol's, and the conversation drifted from football to rising gas prices, eventually landing squarely on the life choices of every attendee. Today, I was the main event. My current employment, or rather, the perceived lack of a proper one in their eyes, became the day's entertainment. Sophia, my cousin, a year younger than me, and already sporting a diamond big enough to blind a small animal, had leaned across the floral tablecloth. Her voice, sweet as saccharine, had sliced right through the polite chatter. Honestly, Alice, what do you even do these days? Seems a bit irrelevant, doesn't it? My name is Alice Long. I'm 29, and Fort Worth, Texas, has been my home since I arrived on this planet in 1996. For most of my life, I'd considered myself pretty relevant, actually. College, then law school, the whole prescribed path. Debt up to my eyeballs, sure, but a clear direction, a purpose. Or so I'd thought. Lately, the universe seemed intent on challenging that notion. The past year had been a tumble, a series of professional pivots that felt more like stumbles in the dark. My law degree, once a beacon of my future, now felt like a heavy, expensive paperweight, especially since I'd stepped away from the traditional firm track to explore something different. Something that apparently didn't register on Sophia's radar of acceptable accomplishments. A sharp pang of humiliation twisted my gut. It wasn't just the word, it was the knowing smirk that accompanied it, the way several other family members had subtly averted their gaze, confirming Sophia's assessment without uttering a syllable. A profound sense of deflation washed over me, leaving me feeling hollowed out. It was a familiar sensation, this feeling of being constantly measured against an invisible yardstick, always coming up short in their estimation. My parents, bless their hearts, had tried to intervene, offering vague platitudes about finding your pass. But even their words had felt thin, like tissue paper against a hurricane. The notion that I was a non-entity, a ghost in my own life, began to fester. What if she was right? What if all my efforts, my pursuit of something more meaningful than billable hours, had just rendered me obsolete? A profound disquiet settled in, a deep-seated apprehension that maybe, just maybe, I'd chosen the wrong route. My vision clouded not from tears, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of every unfulfilled expectation, every unspoken criticism, every moment I'd felt like the outlier in a family that valued traditional success above all else. A dangerous silence stretched in the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the insistent mocking echo of that single annihilating word. The past, viewed through this new, harsh lens, seemed to rearrange itself. Bits of memory, once innocuous, now shimmered with an unsettling luminescence, revealing cracks I hadn't noticed before. This irrelevant sting wasn't a fresh wound at all. Rather, it was the raw exposure of something long buried, a chronic ache I had merely learned to live with. Childhood itself held a curious duality. There were moments of genuine warmth, the kind that still feels like sunshine on my skin, yet overlaid with a persistent, gnawing chill. I was born in 1996, a year my parents often described with a certain detached fondness, as if my arrival was a scheduled event on a crowded itinerary. My earliest recollections are saturated with the distinct sensation of being an afterthought. a charming accessory rather than a central figure. Family gatherings, particularly the large, boisterous ones, often cast me into the periphery. Adults would swirl around me, their laughter echoing, their conversations dense with inside jokes and shared histories I wasn't privy to. A particular image frequently resurfaces. A Sunday luncheon, probably around 2005 or so. We were at my grandmother's house, the air thick with the scent of pot roast and simmering resentment. My older cousin, just a few years older, monopolized the attention, recounting some minor school triumph. Their parents beamed, interrupting to add details, their voices a symphony of pride. I sat quietly, a small dark-haired shadow at the edge of the table, clutching a coloring book that remained stubbornly blank. Nobody addressed me. Nobody asked about my day or my drawings. My attempts to interject, soft murmurs about a good grade or a new friendship, simply evaporated into the din. It was as if my vocal cords had ceased to function, or perhaps more accurately, as if my words possessed no weight, no resonance in that particular room. That specific memory now carries a new weight, a crushing burden of understanding. Back then, I just thought I was shy, or perhaps a bit boring compared to my more vivacious cousin. Now, however, the pattern becomes starkly clear, a consistent omission, a subtle yet pervasive dismissal. Family events weren't about shared connection for everyone. They were stages for certain performances, and my role was consistently that of an extra. Another instance, from when I was maybe 10, involved a school play. I had secured a small but speaking part, and I was absolutely thrilled. I talked about it endlessly, rehearsing my lines for anyone who would listen, mostly the dog. My parents, while acknowledging my excitement, never once offered to help me practice, nor did they ask about the plot. On the night of the performance, they arrived late, slipping into the back row just as my scene began. Afterwards, a quick pat on the head, a mumbled, "Good job," and then their attention instantly pivoted to catching up with a distant aunt who happened to be there. The effort, the joy, the tiny triumph of overcoming my own anxieties to stand on that stage, it was all instantly eclipsed. A quiet, hollow sensation took root, blossoming into a familiar ache in my chest. This feeling, this slow realization of my own perceived insignificance within the family unit, wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a gradual accumulation, like silt settling at the bottom of a river, eventually choking the flow. My parents, absorbed in their own lives, their own aspirations, often seemed to overlook my independent existence. My achievements were acknowledged with a nod, my struggles met with practical, but often emotionally detached, advice. There was no deep dive into my inner world, no genuine curiosity about the nuances of my thoughts or emotions. What truly gnaws at me now, replaying these moments, is the quiet acceptance I exhibited. I internalized the message that my contributions were minimal, that my presence was secondary. I believed it, adopted it as my own personal truth. It shaped me, creating a default setting of deference, a perpetual readiness to cede the spotlight. I learned to anticipate the dismissals, to brace for the subtle slights. This cultivated a strange resilience, but also a deep-seated vulnerability. The word irrelevant didn't just hurt, it confirmed a lifelong suspicion. That afternoon at the family luncheon, the casual cruelty of that pronouncement simply articulated a silent agreement I'd been living under for decades. A bitter truth, finally spoken aloud. The sting of that assessment lingered, not as a sharp pain, but as a dull, persistent ache, subtly reshaping the contours of my ordinary days. Mornings, once a simple progression of coffee and news, now carried a faint tremor of self-scrutiny. I'd catch myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if the person looking back truly possessed any discernible purpose beyond existing. This pervasive unease began to seep into the very walls of my Fort Worth, Texas apartment, a space I'd always considered a sanctuary. Chloe, my roommate, typically a whirlwind of cheerful chaos, became an unwitting participant in this evolving narrative. One Tuesday evening, I walked in after a particularly draining day at the office, ready to collapse onto the sofa. The living room, usually a shared territory, seemed to have shifted. Her art supplies, which normally occupied a corner of the coffee table, had expanded, sprawling across half the surface, almost pushing my well-worn legal texts off the edge. A new, vibrant canvas, still wet with paint, leaned against my favorite armchair, effectively claiming it. It wasn't a malicious act, not deliberately so, but it struck me with an unexpected force. A minor incident, yes, easily explainable by Chloe's usual enthusiasm, yet a peculiar sensation washed over me, a feeling of being displaced. My usual spot, the place where I unwound, felt momentarily inaccessible, taken over. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible encroachment, yet it mirrored the growing sense of invasion within my own thoughts. The apartment, once a reflection of our dual lives, now seemed to lean heavily towards hers. Her vibrant personality, her loud music, the way she effortlessly commanded space started to feel less like charming quirks and more like a gentle, persistent erasure of my own presence. I observed her that night, humming as she mixed colors, completely absorbed in her creative world. She didn't notice my quiet entry, or the way I hesitated by the doorway, a mug in my hand, feeling like an observer in my own home. My usual evening ritual of reading or unwinding with a podcast felt impossible amidst the energetic hum of her activity. I retreated to my bedroom, a small, enclosed space that suddenly seemed to shrink further around me. The silence there was a stark contrast, amplifying the strange sense of isolation. It wasn't just the physical space. Conversations with Chloe, which used to flow so easily, now sometimes felt like I was grasping for purchase, trying to interject a thought into a rushing current. She'd talk excitedly about her gallery aspirations, her new artistic connections, her weekend plans, and I'd find myself nodding along, offering generic affirmations, my own experiences feeling small and uninteresting in comparison. What was I doing with my life, really? My legal research, my quiet evenings, my steady, predictable routine. It all seemed so utterly mundane next to her bright, ambitious trajectory. One afternoon, I discovered a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, addressed to me, half buried under a pile of Chloe's art magazines and exhibition flyers. It wasn't a big deal, just a few bills and a bank statement. But the sight of my name, almost obscured, underscored this unsettling internal dialogue. It was as if even my own correspondence was struggling to assert its existence in the face of her dynamic energy. A quiet question began to form, a whisper at the back of my mind, something I pushed down immediately because acknowledging it felt too frightening. Was I truly fading into the background, not just in my family's eyes, but in my own life? The notion, unarticulated, hung in the air like a fragile, invisible thread, threatening to unravel everything. The simple act of making my morning coffee now carried an unexpected weight. The clatter of the ceramic mug against the granite counter, usually a comforting sound, echoed differently in the quiet apartment. It was as if the very air had thickened, saturated with an unspoken tension that settled on everything. Chloe, my roommate, typically an early riser, had started sleeping in later, or maybe she was just avoiding the kitchen when I was there. Our usual morning banter, a quick exchange about dreams or the day's plans, had dwindled to curt nods or mumbled greetings. Her phone, a constant extension of her hand, seemed to absorb all her attention, even when I tried to initiate a conversation. My questions about her latest art project or upcoming gallery visits were met with brief, non-committal answers, her eyes never quite meeting mine. A wall, invisible yet palpable, had begun to rise between us. Walking to my car each day, the familiar streets of Fort Worth, Texas seemed subtly different. The sunshine, usually a welcome warmth, only highlighted the subtle shifts in my perception. Each turn of the wheel, each red light, became a moment to dwell on the pervasive sense of being overlooked. My social media feeds, once a source of casual distraction, now amplified this disquiet. Scrolling through posts from acquaintances sharing their vibrant lives, their accomplishments, their seemingly effortless joy, a quiet ache would bloom in my chest. It wasn't envy, not exactly, but a stark reminder of the hollow space I perceived within my own existence. The world outside the screen, my own physical surroundings, began to mirror that emptiness. My small living space, the one I had carefully curated to feel like a sanctuary, now seemed to press in on me, its walls offering less comfort and more like a cage. A particular afternoon stands out, etched sharply in my memory. I had been trying to explain a complex legal concept I was grappling with for my research, something that genuinely excited me. Chloe was on the couch, headphones on, sketching in her notebook. I spoke for a few minutes, detailing the nuances, the ethical dilemmas, the potential impact of this obscure case law. When I paused, expecting any acknowledgement, even a hum, there was only the scratch of her pencil. No lift of the head, no flicker of eye contact. It was as if I hadn't uttered a single syllable. The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an active force, a dismissal. It communicated without a single word that my thoughts, my passions, my very presence were inconsequential. A chilling realization dawned. This wasn't just about one person's careless remark. It was a deeper, more insidious pattern. Later that evening, the quiet grew louder. I drafted a text to my parents, describing the persistent unease, the gnawing sensation that I was losing my voice, that my contributions didn't matter. It was a long message, raw and unfiltered. My fingers hovered over the send button for a long moment. Then, with a sudden, overwhelming wave of self-doubt, I deleted the entire draft. What was the point? They would likely offer platitudes, tell me I was overthinking it, or worse, agree with the implicit assessment. The thought of their well-meaning but ultimately invalidating responses was almost as painful as the silence I was already enduring. Looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror that night, my face seemed unfamiliar. My eyes, usually bright with curiosity, now held a shadowed weariness. I traced the faint lines beneath them, noticing how much older I appeared than my 29 years. A tear welled, but I held it back, refusing to let it fall. It registered as a small internal collapse, a concession to the suffocating feeling that had permeated my days. The Alice looking back at me was a stranger, stripped of my usual spark, reduced to a quiet echo. The thought persisted. If I couldn't even acknowledge my own pain, how could anyone else? The room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy, and I just stood there, breathing shallowly, a muted ache settling deep in my bones. The weariness I saw in my own gaze didn't lift with the morning light. It clung, a persistent shadow. As I navigated the usual motions of my Fort Worth, Texas life. Work filled the hours, but my mind often drifted, caught in a loop of past interactions, trying to pinpoint the exact moment this feeling of being lesser took root. I tried to dismiss the gnawing sensation as overthinking, a product of too much introspection. Perhaps I was just being sensitive, creating mountains out of molehills, as my mother Maria often said. Yet, the unease persisted, a low thrum beneath the surface of my daily existence. The actual luncheon unfolded amidst the familiar cacophony of family voices, the clinking of silverware against ceramic, and the underlying hum of unspoken histories and unresolved resentments. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, a woman whose opinions often landed like sharply honed darts, held court at the head of the table. She possessed an uncanny knack for not only identifying insecurities, but with a saccharine smile, twisting them into public conversation pieces. I was seated directly across from her, struggling to focus on a genuine conversation with my cousin, Leo, about his exciting new graphic design gig. My attention drifted back to Carol as she regaled the table with endless anecdotes of her children's achievements. Her daughter, a successful marketing executive, had just landed a huge client. Her son, a burgeoning real estate mogul, bought a second investment property. Each story was punctuated by proud, almost boastful declarations. Then her gaze, sharp, assessing, and deliberately piercing, landed on me. A knowing, almost cruel smirk played on her lips. She asked, her voice, suddenly amplified, carrying clearly across the table's chatter. "Alice still chasing those law books, dear? Or are they chasing you now? What do you actually do with all that theory? It seems so abstract." She then laughed, a brittle, dismissive sound that grated on my ears. "I sometimes wonder what the point is. You're just so utterly irrelevant to the practical world, aren't you?" A profound, heavy silence descended upon our end of the table. Leo, ever empathetic, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My mother, Maria, sitting across from me, cleared her throat, her face flushing a telltale crimson. A hot surge of mortification washed over me, a familiar, unwelcome companion. This time, however, a different current ran beneath it, a fierce, almost primal, protective defiance. I bit back the sharp retort that sprang to mind, choosing instead to simply meet her gaze, holding it steady. Her words, irrelevant, echoed the festering doubt that had plagued me for what felt like a lifetime. Yet, in that moment, seeing the smug, self-righteous satisfaction on her face, the word lost some of its power. It was her judgment, steeped in her own narrow world view, not my inherent truth. A simmering indignation, not the explosive kind, but a steady, persistent internal fire began to ignite a new resolve. This deep-seated conviction spurred a much-needed re-evaluation of the connections I maintained. The initial steps felt tentative, almost like testing the water before a plunge. One evening, scrolling through social media, a name appeared that made my stomach tighten with a familiar dread. It belonged to my cousin Isabella, someone whose perfectly curated life, broadcast relentlessly, had often amplified my deep-seated sense of inadequacy. Her posts served as a constant reminder of a life I should be living, or so her posts always subtly implied. Without a second thought, my thumb hovered, then executed the unfollow button. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a quiet severing of a digital tie, yet it felt like removing a persistent, irritating splinter from my soul. The following days saw a series of similar deliberate acts of self-reclamation. Certain group chats, once a source of subtle, gnawing anxiety, were muted. Invitations to gatherings that historically left me feeling drained, invisible, or utterly overlooked were politely declined with vague yet firm excuses that left no room for debate. My phone, once a constant, demanding portal into everyone else's lives, became a tool I wielded with a newfound, almost surgical discretion. I started to filter what I shared, choosing to keep my victories and even my struggles fiercely closer to my chest. It was a conscious effort to build a protective wall, not of isolating myself entirely, but of profound self-preservation. A shift in my demeanor became palpable to my family, those who paid enough attention to notice. My cousin, Isabella, who usually maintained a polite but perfunctory interest, called one afternoon. Her voice, typically breezy, now carried a distinct note of mild confusion, almost suspicion. She asked if everything was all right, mentioning I'd been a bit scarce lately. I gave her a generic answer, something about work picking up and quickly, almost automatically, steered the conversation toward her latest travel plans. The old Alice would have launched into a detailed explanation, perhaps even apologizing for my perceived absence. This new version of me, however, offered only a polite evasion, a small but significant boundary set. The conversation dissolved quickly, leaving a subtle, lingering tension in its wake. A few days later, a text arrived from Isabella. It was an invitation to a casual brunch, specifically mentioning that everyone would be there. A wave of familiar dread threatened to engulf me, but a deeper, unwavering resolve asserted itself. I looked at the message, weighing my response. The old me would have instantly RSVP'd yes, then agonizing over it for days. This time, I took a deep breath. My fingers moved across the screen, composing a concise, yet firm refusal. No lengthy justification, no apology, simply, I have other plans. Then without hesitation, I pressed send. That small, firm no wasn't just a refusal. It was a quiet declaration of independence, a silent act of resistance echoing a newly discovered self-possession. My daily routines began to reflect this internal transformation. Mornings were still for coffee, but now I'd sit on my patio, watching the Fort Worth, Texas sky change colors, finding a quiet solace in the shifting hues, deliberately not reaching for my phone until I felt a profound readiness within myself. Work projects, particularly the complex legal concepts I was wrestling with, demanded my undivided attention, free from the mental clutter of external expectations. I found myself pursuing knowledge with a renewed vigor, the clamor of external expectations fading into the background. My apartment, once merely a place I slept, a waypoint between social engagements, now truly became my sanctuary. A week later, an invitation arrived, formal, crisp, and embossed, requesting my presence at the annual Fort Worth Bar Association Gala. My mentor, Judge Eleanor Vance, had nominated me for the prestigious Rising Star Award, an honor recognizing young attorneys who demonstrate exceptional promise and commitment to public service. My stomach performed a nervous somersault, a mix of apprehension and disbelief. This was undeniably a very big deal. The evening arrived a whirlwind of polished faces, gleaming shoes, and hushed, expectant conversations. I wore a dress I'd saved for months, something elegant and understated, chosen to project a quiet confidence, feeling a curious blend of feeling both utterly out of place and, paradoxically, perfectly where I belonged. The room hushed as Judge Vance approached the podium. She began her speech, her voice resonant and commanding, detailing the accomplishments of the evening's awardees. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then, she spoke my name. Our final honoree tonight, Alice Long, embodies the very spirit of dedication and intellectual rigor that our profession not only demands, but thrives upon. A warm wave of heat, a flush of unexpected pride, spread across my cheeks. She detailed my extensive pro bono work, my academic achievements, and my persistent, meticulous efforts in navigating complex legal concepts for underserved communities. Each accolade she listed, each measured phrase, chipped away at the insidious, irrelevant label that had burrowed its way so deeply into my mind. She concluded, "It is with immense pride that I present the Fort Worth Bar Association's Rising Star Award to attorney Alice Long." The applause that followed was a warm, resounding, affirming wave. As I walked to the stage, the room blurring slightly around the edges, I caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Aunt Carol. Her expression was a peculiar mix of shock, disbelief, and something unmistakably akin to grudging respect. The recognition, delivered by such a respected judge in front of an entire elite legal community, felt like a profound physical weight, truly lifting from my shoulders. That evening, The words Attorney Alice Long became more than just a title. They transformed into a formidable shield. The lingering ghost of irrelevance, that insidious whisper which had plagued me since that crushing family luncheon, finally began to dissipate, to evaporate like morning mist. I understood then that validation from others, particularly those who sought to diminish me, held no true, lasting power. My worth, I realized, wasn't contingent on their fleeting approval. It was inherent, built patiently on the quiet, persistent work I'd done, the knowledge I'd painstakingly acquired, and the dedicated service I aimed to provide. The journey to that realization had been painful, marked by profound self-doubt and the sharp sting of ungenerous words. Not every fractured relationship was instantly mended. Some wounds, particularly the oldest ones, remained subtle, aching scars on my personal landscape. Yet, I had recovered something far more vital, my own authentic voice, my own unshakable sense of self, utterly independent of external judgment. Later that night, back in my quiet Fort Worth apartment, I opened my laptop. An email from Aunt Carol. Subject line, "Congratulations," sat, glaringly unread. My finger hovered, then, with a decisive click, I sent it to the trash without opening it. The screen went dark, reflecting my own calm, resolute face, no longer clouded by doubt or the need for external validation.